Hello and welcome to our second installment of Dialogue for Change, Invariant's speaker series featuring critical conversations about racial injustice and inequality and actions we can take to influence change in the public and private sector. This speaker series and the conversations it facilitates aim to provide understanding to participants and also provide concrete actions we can take to make change as individuals, employees, and company executives. Just want to thank all of our panelists for joining today. Patrick Burke, Ganesha Martin, and Chief Charles Ramsey. Today's discussion aims to provide context and law enforcement perspective to the national demand for police reform reverberating in city streets across the country. Protests brought on by more video footage of police brutality and the deaths of Black men and women, something we have seen before but can no longer stand to ignore. As a Black man, this issue is particularly concerning to me. I was only 15 when I first felt the forearm of a police officer on the back of my neck. I hadn't committed a crime. I wasn't being arrested, but that particular officer was just demonstrating what he could do if I didn't, as he put it, watch myself. It was a difficult, frustrating, and terrifying moment, knowing that my fate and maybe even my life was in his hands, although I hadn't done anything wrong. Part of this conversation is understanding that while there are some police officers out there that have taken some unnecessary, unfortunate actions, there are many police officers that wish only to serve their communities. And I'm hopeful that in today's discussion with our distinguished speakers, we'll be able to come to some solutions, bring new ideas and perspectives to this conversation so that my son hopefully won't face some of the same issues that I've faced over the course of my life. Our speakers bring perspectives as law enforcement leaders and as advocates to our discussion of policing procedures, accountability, and paths to reform that include engagement from businesses and individuals. We have asked them to help us consider the current state of policing and what police forces must do in order to address institutional behaviors and practices that lead to mistreatment of communities of color. I'm pleased to introduce Patrick Burke. Patrick Burke currently serves as the Executive Director of the DC Police Foundation after finishing a term as U.S. Marshal for the District of Columbia and serving 27 years with the DC Metropolitan Police Department. Ganesha Martin. Ganesha is a lawyer who led the federal court-ordered consent decree reforms efforts at the Baltimore Police Department from 2015 to 2018. Her work focuses squarely on uniting communities of color and the police who swear to serve and protect them. Our last finalist is Chief Charles Ramsey. He is the former commissioner of the Philadelphia Police Department. Prior to assuming that post in January of 2008, he served as chief of the Metropolitan Police Department in Washington, D.C. from 1998 to early 2007. I'd like to begin by inviting each of our distinguished panelists to help us level set the conversation by sharing their own sense of the current state of policing and how far we are from changing desperate practices and behaviors. And I'd like to ask Chief Ramsey to start off.
Thanks a lot, Quincy. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you this afternoon. This is a very trying time for policing in the United States, but it's also a time of tremendous opportunity for change. You know, we talk about change all the time, and there are some changes that do take place, but not enough to really have an impact on what takes place out there in communities across the country. What I see right now is a real opportunity for systemic fundamental change to occur in policing. When you look at everything that's going on now, you look at the diversity of people that are protesting, certainly with the attention that it's gotten now from our elected leaders and police chiefs across the country, I think now is the time. There are a lot of issues to be addressed, but I also think it's very important for us to be thoughtful as we begin the process of making changes within policing. Many of the things being talked about now, many departments have in policy, chokeholds, for an example, would be one, but there are 18,000 police departments in the United States, anywhere between 800 and 900,000 police officers. And so it's a monumental task to get any kind of standardization to occur throughout the United States, but it's doable. I think we do need to have some national standards, but also each state has to take it upon itself to review the training curriculum, both recruit training, in-service training, and also add an educational component to it, because I think it's important that police officers today understand the history of policing in America, because that history is not one that has always been positive. In fact, in many areas, police were used to enforce discriminatory laws, for an example. And that baggage, if you will, haunts us to this day. And so the men and women that are serving today may not have been a part of that, but they need to understand that's part of the legacy of policing in America, which is why relationships in some communities are more strained than others. If we know it, if we study it, if we take a look at where we are and what we're doing, then I think we can start to build the bridges that we need to build to have stronger relationships with all of our communities across the board. So with that, Quincy, I'm gonna turn it back over to you, but thanks again, and I look forward to the discussion today.
Absolutely. I would love to hear Ganesha and Pat, if you guys wouldn't mind just commenting on kind of where you guys think things are going, and if you have something you'd like to add to what Chief Ramsey said.
Yeah, so I think it's a watershed moment. Not only the diversity of the folks that we see in the streets here, but I lived in Japan, and I can tell you right now that it is not normal for them to walk down the street with signs that say Black Lives Matter, and talking about policing issues. It's just not what they do. And so because of that, I think that we have to take the opportunity where people from all different levels, ethnic background, socioeconomic, are paying attention to not only policing, but just how race, is a factor in our everyday life. And one of the things I've been cautioning folks about is when we're talking about policing and perhaps even defunding the police and moving resources from the police to other places, while I think that conversation is necessary, because the police right now do a lot of things that they're just not trained to do, and are just standing in the gap when it comes to folks that are suffering from mental and behavioral health crisis, homeless, those things. There are actually people who went to school, have clinical backgrounds to be able to address those issues. But I also hear in those same industries racism and discrimination and bias as it relates to social workers. And so while it's police that has brought this to the forefront, which is necessary because they're the only profession that can take your life and take your freedom. So it's rightfully so that I think bad behavior amongst police are at the center of this conversation. I think it's critical that the conversation continues to be about how systemic racism plays a role in everything that we're doing. And we can't lose sight either that we need this emotion and the anger to translate into not only policy, which is the easy part, not only training, which is a little bit more difficult, but still easy. But the accountability mechanisms that have to be put in place so that we are making sure that all of the things that are coming into place right now through training and policy actually are sustainable, that we're changing infrastructure, and that we are creating the police departments across the country that our communities want and deserve.
And Quincy, I think one of the challenges really is, what do we do with this great momentum that we have at this moment? Because, you know, I keep asking myself, why are we here again? This isn't a new thing. We've been here over and over again. I know Chief Ramsey was involved in the 21st Century Task Force on Policing, and a lot of these ideas have been talked about in the past, and we come up with some potential best practices or policies, and then that an administration changes and it gets put up on a shelf. So am I confident that this won't happen again? No. And when Chief Ramsey talks about those 18,000 police departments, you know, really think about that volume, and that 75% of those agencies have fewer than 50 people, and the lack of standardization. So while a lot of agencies may be making change and taking on these reforms, and their political leaders are leading the reform efforts, unfortunately, there are agencies out there that aren't taking that same initiative. And I have a lot of great concern about that. So it really starts when you think about recruiting the officers, who are we hiring in the first place? How are we screening those officers? Are those standardized approaches? If an officer is fired from one agency or leaves before being fired, are they being hired by another agency? That's a real challenge, and we need standardization and a national database in some of those areas as well. How are we training those officers? And it varies widely from agency to agency. And as Ganesha mentioned too, we're giving officers, young officers, inexperienced officers, that power to take somebody's freedom through arrest, or potentially take somebody's life. Two great powers that shouldn't be minimized whatsoever. And we really need to make sure we're putting the right people behind those badges when we're giving them those power, and training them the right way so that they're not abusing those powers as we go forward. And with all the policies that we have, and I think a lot of agencies are making good efforts to move in the right direction, or to benchmark best practices, not everyone's doing that. And you also think about patterns and practices. An agency might have a policy on the books where we don't chase stolen automobiles, but are they doing it with a wink and a nod and protecting each other from doing that? So I think it really starts at the top, that change, and really making sure if we have those policies in place that we're adhering to those policies. And we're seeing sometimes the legislature come in and mandating, even if let's say a chokehold ban is in effect, that it's against the law as well. So I have a lot of concerns. I think it's a great opportunity to seize the momentum that we have right now, and it is a watershed moment. But, you know, we've said it before, here we are again, here we are again, here we are again. You know, and reforms have been made and pushed before, but I can understand the frustration in the community. And I think that's why we've seen some of the actions that have been taken. People are frustrated, and I understand that. We need, as a police community, on a national level, federal, local level, we need to do better.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much. I think that was a wonderful job of kind of setting the stage for this conversation. And I think, Pat, one of the things that you were talking about in terms of some of the procedures and recruiting, you know, really dovetails into, you know, my first question. And I think you all touched on it. But the fact of the matter is, you know, police procedure is often a point of emphasis in situations such as the killing of George Floyd and some of the other situations that we've seen over the past months, years, and decades. Clearly, there's a need to ensure that standard police procedure doesn't lead to unnecessary injury or death. And, you know, if there's not proper procedures in place, communities and officials will find it exceedingly difficult, if not impossible, to hold a potentially overzealous police officer accountable because those standards aren't in place. So I guess my question is, you know, what are the changes that we need to see in procedure. We've heard terms such as use of force, de-escalation, chokeholds, no-knock warrants, all of these things over the news over the past few weeks and months. And so I just want to hear if you all have any, specific things, like what's most in need of change. Because in some of the instances, what we found is, even though it seems like there was some sort of tactic or procedure used, it wasn't necessarily against police procedure. So where do you all find the most place for change? And I'd like to start off with Ganesha on this one, being that you worked on the dissent decree in Baltimore. So I'd love for you to start us off.
So I think there's two things going on here. When I first saw the murder of George Floyd, I had to start questioning all the work that I was doing. How do you write a policy that stops a man from killing another man in broad daylight while being, filmed? And so, I had to start thinking about how do we deal with those people evil? I don't even want to call him a bad apple. And so then I started thinking about, well, who is this guy in the police department? And what I mean by that is he a person who, had several complaints, both internal and external, and there was never any discipline? Was he a person who, went out for drinks with the commander? Who was this guy and what kind of power and weight did he carry within the police department? And I also assumed that there was no way there was a duty to intervene policy. As the news played out, turns out there was a duty to intervene policy in place. Turns out this guy had 18 years on and complaints that it doesn't look like he'd been disciplined for. And then also he was a training officer, and he had actually trained those officers, some of them that were there, on the street with him. And so the things to me that don't get talked about very often, but I think have to be really emphasized here is number one, whistleblower. And I'd like to come up with a whole nother different term, but those folks, that were there, even the ones that had only been on the force for a couple of days, there's only a couple of shifts they've been on, they need to understand from the time that they apply to the police department, what are the standards? What are the expectations of you as a police officer, law enforcement officer? And then those same ethics, those same principles need to carry into the academy. What happens often, and it happens to all of us, we go to class, we hear, even in college, we hear, the professor drone on, and we walk out and we hear and we remember, half of it. The things about your ethical duty to intervene when you see another officer doing something that's not right has to be, every professor should be saying it. It should be in every part of the curriculum. And then I think we should go so far as, the governor in Massachusetts, I think is offering incentive pay for just doing de-escalation. I think that should be basic training, but there should be something where these police officers do not believe that their pension that they rely on to take care of their family, that, that they're going to, be demoted or busted down to midnight shifts. There has to be a strong, and this message is not only in the police department, it should be coming from the legislators. It should be coming from the federal government. It should be coming from everybody, where people say, if you stand up in these situations, you are going to be taken care of. So I think that's critical. I think like I said, the duty to intervene can't be just a policy, can't be a training. It has to be something that, is brought to life. The last thing I'll say on this is that a person who lays on a person's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds has undoubtedly shown characteristics of an unstable person long before that day. And I can guarantee you there were hushed conversations in the halls of that police department that says, I'm not surprised. That has got to stop. Some of the things that have been implemented to Assistant Chief Burke's point, early intervention systems. These are things that have been put into place both in title and training, but the accountability is horrendous. And so I think, those things having been put in place, but then having the accountability on the other side, and also having support for the folks who actually implement those sorts of solutions, I think is critical here.
Yeah, thank you. I think you've laid it out pretty well there. Love to hear if Assistant Chief Burke or Chief Ramsey have anything to add in terms of, some of the procedures that we need to be focusing on, taking into account that there are 18,000 police forces and different police departments have different needs and face different issues. But is there a couple of things that, just shouldn't be done by police officers when dealing with a suspect? Like we've heard about chokehold bans and things like that, and we've heard about potentially no-knock warrants. Is there a couple of things at the top that we've seen that just shouldn't be part of what a police officer does?
Quincy, one thing, just very quickly, just to kind of build a little bit on what Ganesha was just saying. First of all, the George Floyd situation, the officer Chauvin, who was involved in that particular situation, there is no policy or procedure that covers what he did. I mean, he was so far off base in terms of any kind of training or procedures or what have you, that it's difficult to even describe. Not only was his actions criminal, it was just sadistic. And Ganesha's right, that's not the first time. He didn't wake up that day and all of a sudden have that mindset. And so the fact that he had, I believe they say 17 prior complaints. What were those complaints? What was done with that? And to think that someone selected him to be a field training officer, I mean, that's a command decision. That's some command official that made that decision that he should serve as a field training officer. That person needs to be held accountable as well. So accountability can't just stop with the actions of that officer. I mean, you need to look all the way up the chain and say, how could somebody like that even exist within our police department? You have to look at, I think, even though this is, slightly off this one particular topic, but it's an issue. And that's the power of police unions, that over the years, they have gotten stronger and stronger and stronger. And it is incredibly hard to get rid of police officers that you believe have no business being police officers. It's increasingly difficult. That has to be dealt with. I'm not anti-union. Unions play a critical role in seeing to it, people get paid benefits and the kinds of things that they deserve for the work that they do. But some of the contracts that cities, by the way, have signed off on, okay, they signed off on it, have gotten to a point where you fire an individual, they wind up going to arbitration, they get back. I've had individuals that I fired more than once for different offenses. And that's just ridiculous to have to go through that. And so we've got to look at the entire system, and everybody needs to be held accountable, whether you're talking about the officials that make these decisions, like in this case, to make this guy a training officer and not take action because of the conduct that he's exhibited over the years, unions that protect them, arbitrators that feel that their role is to sometimes give some to the unions and in some cases to management, as opposed to just weighing each case based on the facts and making a decision based on facts and let the cards fall where they may. City officials that sign off on these contracts that limit management rights. I mean, it goes on and on and on. So this isn't just about training or writing a new policy or what have you. The system is broken. It needs to be fixed, but it won't be fixed if everybody from top to bottom isn't held accountable.
Right. And I think when it comes to looking at that accountability specifically for use of force, every single use of force needs to be reviewed. So one of the things that I think any agency should have in place as well is a use of force review board, whether it's somebody involved in an injury due to handcuffing, excessive handcuffing, to using a taser, to using an asp or a tactical baton, to potential deadly use of force. So every time in DC, for instance, even if an officer were to pull his or her weapon and point it at somebody, they have to go through a use of force review board. And I think that's not only an opportunity to hold people accountable, but also to look for training efficiencies or deficiencies. What could we do better? Because when you look at a lot of these cases that have happened around the country where the officers have actually been justified in these killings, and I'll give you an example of Tamir Rice in Cleveland, we've got to look at the tactics that officers are using. So we've got the policies in place, but if your policy is don't shoot at or from a moving vehicle unless your life is in danger, well, don't put yourself in front of a moving vehicle, or you're going to have to shoot at it and then deal with the subsequent consequences of a vehicle driving out of control. If you're responding to a bank robbery, an officer doesn't drive up to the front of the bank where everybody can see him and the bandits can see him. They pull up inconspicuously. They use cover and concealment. But when we use bad tactics, and I'll give you the example of approaching a mental health consumer, a person with, let's say, bipolar, who's got a butter knife and is having a bad day. If we go into that house as a police officer and we say, drop the knife, drop the knife, drop the knife, we approach that person without attempting to de-escalate to talk, and we shoot that person, that officer might be justified because, hey, that person was right there with the knife in their hand, they could have stabbed them. But what about, thinking the way we do things tactically again? We can de-escalate, we can pull back, we can use cover and concealment. It doesn't have to be drop the gun, drop the knife, boom, boom, boom. There's other things that we can do, and we have to review every single one of those incidents and learn from every single use of force what we can do better and how we can train our officers better.
Well, thank you so much.
I think
please.
I think you wanted somebody to address the chokehold and some of those things. I'll be really brief and probably a little bit controversial. So I look at these things from the aspect of human beings, right? Both the community and the police. So if police have been trained up to this point that part of what they can do to keep themselves safe and alive is a chokehold, I think we're completely fine banning it. I think I don't see as a civilian a use for it. But on the other side of banning a chokehold or no-knock warrants, that happened in the death of Breonna Taylor, have a conversation with the police about the fact that you're taking that away, and if there's something else that can go in that place or something where they're not feeling like you're just continuously taking things away from me that are making me feel unsafe. And yeah, what the murder of George Floyd did was horrible, but I'm a good guy. And when there's somebody that I'm wrestling with on the ground who's trying to go for my gun and kill me, like I know that's happening, you're taking something away from me, and that makes me fearful. And so I think those conversations should be happening behind the scenes. So that it's a give and take on both sides for both the community and the police.
Well, I would agree with that, because I think what needs to happen, it is a use of deadly force. We have to see it for what it is. It is a use of deadly force if you apply a chokehold on someone. But if someone's trying to get your gun, and and you're on the ground fighting, and that's the only tool you have available to you, understand that's a use of deadly force. So if you be justified in using your firearm, then that'd be the only time you'd be justified in using a chokehold. So, outright banning, I can understand where people are coming from, but to be honest with you, having been out there on the street, if you are truly in a fight for your life, you're going to do what you have to do to survive, and you'll explain it later. And so the last thing you're going to be thinking about is policy number whatever, and whether or not you're going to get in trouble if it's that serious. But by and large, I would prohibit it. And then if an officer did apply it, it would have to be under some extreme circumstances. It's like shooting at a moving vehicle. If you've got a terrorist, which you've seen in some countries, is actually running people down intentionally and doing acts like that, it may be, you can't say never. Maybe there would be some extreme circumstance where taking the driver out would be something that would be understandable. but how often would something like that occur? I mean, that would be so rare. And as Pat said, now you've got the problem with a dead driver behind the wheel as opposed to a living driver. So it's complicated, and we need to really pick through all these cases individually and really look for, okay, what if any alternatives were there? Is that realistic? Were the actions of the officer appropriate under those circumstances, which don't translate into it being okay tomorrow in a different set of circumstances? You have to look at these cases hard, and it really starts like what Pat said. We call them near misses, incidents where no one was injured and so forth. That doesn't mean you don't pick that incident apart and you don't look for whether or not the tactics were sound. Are there training opportunities? You know, the officers' actions, did they make sense? Are they exercising good judgment? You know, we have to be able to pick these things apart before a tragedy occurs, as opposed to waiting until the tragedy is there and then we start to pick that particular case apart.
Well, that's, Chief, I think that actually goes straight to, you know, what my next question was going to be. And I think you all touched on it a little bit, but want to dig down a little bit deeper into the accountability bucket. You know, obviously accountability is probably one of the most important parts of this conversation, because if you can have procedures in place. I think Ganesha noted that there was a duty to intervene in Minneapolis, but we didn't see that happen. And so now, you know, when we look at accountability, and I think you said it earlier, Chief, in a great way, that there has to be accountability kind of up and down the line. So my thought process and the question I have for you all is, you know, how can we ensure that there's accountability for the actions of police officers in the field before they leave the station, during an encounter with a suspect, and after an encounter with a suspect? Because, you know, I've learned over my time that the biggest motivator to changing behavior is accountability and consequences. And then without those, behavior doesn't change. So, you know, how can we do that? How can we make sure we have accountability, like I said, before they even leave the police station, during and after an encounter with a suspect?
Who do you want to take that one?
I will actually, since Chief Burke, if you don't mind, I'd like to start off with you on this one and get your thoughts first.
And I think it really starts at the top. A lot of agencies have a history of a bad culture in their department, whether it's terms that they use, or I've heard rough ride and pain guaranteed and different terms used to describe department. That takes a long time to get rid of those monikers. But I think leadership really drives that process and that culture of the department forward. Really, when you think about the mission statements for any police department too, does it talk about the sanctity of human life? And then when you talk about, you know, down to the field level, leaving the station every day, are there supervisors, especially the patrol sergeants, responding to calls to monitor the way things are done and making sure that officers aren't overreacting to situations, or knowing that they're going to be held accountable if they were to engage in any use of force that wasn't authorized or outside of policy? And then, as I talked about with the use of force review boards, anytime there is a use of force, officers have to know that, you know, whether it is a tactical training recommendation or potential negative discipline because they were outside of policy, that it's hopefully to reform them and help them to improve on either their tactics or their efforts to go forward in the future. But I think it really does start at the top, that it is a cultural issue, and that officers know as well. And I used to establish this very clearly too. If anybody were to do anything in front of me, know that I'm going to report it. And it has to be understood that officers, while we protect each other and, you know, we're responsible for making sure each other gets home safely at night, there's limits to that. And that we understand the department's going to hold us accountable for our actions in a reasonable way and help us to make improvements. But once again, we know that we're responsible for our actions and looking out for each other while holding each other accountable as well.
You know, just I agree with everything that Pat just said. And obviously, accountability trickles all the way down at every single level. You know, we saw an example. We have to highlight the examples that we do see. And I think back a couple weeks ago in New York, and I believe it was in Brooklyn, outside of the stadium where the Brooklyn Nets play. And things were getting pretty heated. You know, I mean, there was a lot of confrontation, yelling, screaming, and so forth. And there was this one officer who was obviously getting heated. I mean, he was in a one-on-one with a particular guy, and you could see that this was going to turn ugly probably very quickly. And then all of a sudden, there was a hand that came behind the officer, grabbed him on the shoulder, kind of gently pulled him back, and took his place in line. Now, he intervened. Something was about to happen. You could see it starting to develop. But he stepped in because we're human beings too. People do lose their tempers, okay? And I hate to go back to this, the way it was in the old days, because the old days weren't all that hot either, okay? But I do remember a time when I was a young cop coming up through Chicago Police Department, that if somebody saw you getting a little too heated or a little too angry, a veteran cop would say, I got this. Don't worry about it. I got this. And they would step in. Why? They weren't going to let you throw your career away over some nonsense that a year from now, you wouldn't even remember what the heck it was about. Because that's just the way it is. Just that one moment where your temper just got a little out of control. It happens to everybody. And if we don't look out for each other and step in, when you first start to see things start to go a little south and step in, then it's a problem. It should never get to whether or not I take somebody's knee off of somebody's neck. Those are the obvious ones. Right. But the real culture shift happens when it happens with stuff that never makes the video, never makes, the conversation or anything like that. It could be something as small as, a cop's driving a car and runs a red light for no reason. And the person said, what are you doing? Well, no. How are you going to enforce the law if you don't obey the law? Right? Because the public sees that stuff, and that's how we start to lose legitimacy. Right? Or there's a talk, don't talk on your cell phone. You pull up next to a police car. What's the guy got? Phone to his ear, talking on the cell phone, and he's not calling communications center. I can almost guarantee you that. Okay? And so it's the little things that give people that comfort and the ability to then, when something major happens, there ain't no doubt somebody's going to step in because they do it all the time. That's real duty to intervene.
And just to follow up on what the chief is saying here, and to your question about roll call and in the encounter and then after the fact, I've worked in a police department as a civilian. I've been in a lot of other police departments, and there are kind of these diamonds in the rough, if you will. Chief Ramsey wouldn't tell you that he's anything special, but we know that he is. And he's always had a little bit, I know he's always had a little bit of that. And I've seen that in police departments, where naturally you have a leadership feeling, you have kind of this duty, and you have this way about you where you can correct folks without feeling like, you're putting yourself in a certain place. But I think generally as human beings, peer pressure is that it's hard for people to speak up when they fear that they're going to be ostracized. This blue line and this blue wall and all these sorts of things, this is not equally distributed. It is a fractured line that picks and chooses. And unfortunately, what happens is the worst officers are the loudest officers, and that's what we see. We don't see these gestures that the chief mentioned. And so I personally think that sort of training on how to have those conversations, when to have those conversations, and again, to make sure that people, it's an accepted thing. So in roll call, before police are going out, have your sergeant, have your lieutenant, have your commanders in there saying, guys, this is what we stand for. These are our expectations. So there's not a question. You're not, when you're in the car, on patrol with somebody who says something out of line, let me run the red light. Let's go over here and see what's up with these guys on the corner with no justification. Then you know that it is the larger expectation from your department that is not okay. When you leave a person in this ambiguous situation where it's just them standing up because that's what they feel is right, then you're putting people, particularly young officers, in a very precarious situation. And so I think those type of dynamics, just as human beings, where it's hard to sometimes speak up when there's peer pressure, that the infrastructure, the training, the recruitment, all those sorts of things have to take those things into account. I think the other thing that people don't really talk about very much as it relates to accountability is technology. In Baltimore City, when the Department of Justice came in to investigate us, and they said, well, are you desperately stopping, African-American males at a certain time? They were like, hold on, let me go into this room where there's boxes on the floor, and let me look through all of these stop tickets, and then maybe I can tell you something. That's completely unacceptable. And that's the 8th largest police department in the United States. And I can tell you, out of the other 18,000, that's par for the course. And that's the issue for a couple of different reasons. First of all, when you have levels of high violent crime, your mayor, your county executive, your city council, when you come over there talking about technology, if it's not stopping somebody from dying, then they're looking at you like, you have 3 eyes. But the real issue is if the community is saying that the police are doing things, they are desperately stopping people, they're using excessive force, but you don't have the ability to hit a button to run the data to see if that's true, then the chief can't hold his rank and file accountable. And the mayor and the city and government can't hold that chief and commissioner accountable. And so one of the things that I hope comes out of this moment is, even though, of course, it's going to be difficult in these defund conversations, but you've got to be able to have technology in police departments that not only communicate to the community, this is what your police officers are doing, but that your chief and your commissioners can use to hold the rank and file accountable. And the last thing I'll say on this is, we always talk about police. And again, I understand why police are at the center of our conversation, but police commissioners and police chiefs are employees. They are not independent, they can just do whatever they want to. So the conversations with the mayors and the county executives, what are they doing? What is their accountability as far as holding officers, to task? Like the chief said earlier, these, and I said in lots of these meetings, it's politicians and lawyers that are negotiating these contracts. And, in Baltimore, we had somebody with over 100 complaints. And the commissioner and I at the time said, how is this person still here? It's ridiculous. And so, we had to kind of, really work to make sure that a person who was a menace to the communities, there were TV or news articles about him, multiple complaints, but because he brought the guns and because he brought the drugs, nobody questioned where those guns or drugs came from and whether he did it legitimately. But because he was helping reduce violent crime, his disciplinary record was, dismissed. And what does that happen? What makes that, when you see that happen in a police department, then good officers stay quiet. And so you've got to, in the roll call, express what the expectations are. On the street, you've got to have, those moments where people act that way. And then on the end, after the accident, or after the incident, you've got to be able to give the power to the police chief, to the police commissioner, to get those people out of the police department as soon as possible.
No, I think, thank you. I think you hit the nail on the head for sure, all of you, with that question. And I think, you know, we've been discussing a lot of these issues in the context of what can we do better in terms of procedure and holding people accountable. But now I kind of want to turn to a little bit, you know, different take on it. And, you know, fortunately, Ganesha, you've already touched on it. Chief Ramsey, you've already touched on it. Assistant Chief Burke, I think you have as well. But police officers face a daunting task every day. And I think to a large extent, the police officers across this country are actually good people and want to do, you know, the right thing. And so, like, how do we balance holding police officers accountable versus creating an environment where good officers no longer want to serve the community? And, you know, in this conversation, one of the things that has been floated around a lot has been talk of qualified immunity and what changes need to be made to that. And, you know, I just want to hear, you know, we have to have a balance here, because we can't just, you know, smash on the police all the time, and now nobody wants to be a police officer. It's harder than it's ever been to recruit police officers. And I think the harder it is to recruit them, the harder it's going to be to make sure you only have good ones, right? Because now your numbers are down. You're just going to take who you could get. So, you know, if I could get you all to kind of touch on that a little bit, maybe we could start with you, Chief Ramsey, on how do we reach that balance between accountability and keeping good officers in our communities?
Well, my personal opinion is we need to be very careful if they're going to start to try to limit qualified immunity, which basically shields officers from civil suits, provided, of course, they're operating within the law. It's going to be very, very difficult, I think, to explain or come up with something that is going to make officers pretty comfortable. I think the thought of that is going to be something that's going to lead to a lot of people probably leaving the profession or not getting involved to begin with. I'd like to take a real serious look at that. I think part of the problem we're having right now, and this is, again, just my opinion, with the heightened emotions. People are just, you know, well, just get rid of qualified immunity without even knowing what the heck it is, okay? So what is it that you're trying to get away from? First of all, there's no shortage of lawsuits being filed against police departments in this country. And tons of money, millions and millions of dollars are being paid out on a regular basis. If an officer is acting outside of the color of law, like let's say the George Floyd case and so forth, civil suits, city's not going to cover that guy. The city will be sued, no doubt about it, because, you know, training, accountability, all those things. But believe me, he's probably going to get slapped with a lawsuit himself. But officers exercise discretion every single day. And you may or may not agree with the outcome or the choice that they made when it came to taking a particular action. It was nothing illegal about it. It really was not even outside of policy. But now are you open to lawsuits because someone just doesn't agree with how you handled something? We need to be careful when we examine this to make sure that we don't get frivolous lawsuits around just anything that takes place. At the same time, we do need to be able to hold officers accountable. So I just don't know where that balance is, because part of what's really, I think, beginning to happen, and officers are beginning to feel it, they don't feel like you're getting in due process at all. An incident occurs, you get fired the same day, and you even get charged within 3 or 4 days. Now, anybody who's been around a while knows doggone well prosecutors do not do things that fast normally. Okay, I had cases sitting in the DA's office for a year, 2 years, before I get a letter of declination. That's real, okay? Now, I'm not saying it takes a year or 2 years to resolve these cases, but what I'm saying is that when it looks as if you're just moving fast because of political considerations or community pressure, then for those men and women that are out there, they're gonna say, hey, listen, why would I put myself out there? Why would I do anything proactively, knowing that if anything goes down and if somebody thinks that I did something wrong? And let me tell you something, everything's on video now. Use of force is an ugly thing to look at, whether it's justified or not, even justified, it is just not pretty to look at. And so will I then have automatically be suspended, automatically lose my job or whatever? We've got to find that balance. And I'm not saying that what took place is not justified. I'm just saying you got to be careful. We're in an emotional period of time. And what we've got to do is make sure that we make good decisions. We do hold people accountable, but we don't rush to judgment to a point where, you know, we don't even know all the facts before we take all the actions that we could possibly take. So yeah, I have some issues, obviously, with this whole notion of qualified immunity, with defunding the police, disbanding the police. You know, disband the police and replace with what? Chicago last weekend, Father's Day weekend, 104 people shot, 14 dead. You think we ought to disband the Chicago Police Department? That doesn't mean the Chicago PD doesn't need reform. Believe me, they do. But replace them with what? You know, defund the police, reallocate the money. Word to the wise, follow the money. I was a police chief for 17 years, and every year cities came by to take money out of my budget to fill gaps that they had elsewhere. And money goes in the general fund. If what they're saying is, and what the community is saying is, they want social services to be better funded and so forth, see where the money goes. And I guarantee you it ain't all going there.
That's right.
Follow the money. Follow the money. It's easy to take money out of budgets, but where's it going? And police, I guarantee you, will still be the primary responders at 2 o'clock in the morning for somebody going through a mental health crisis, a substance abuse issue, or whatever. Because social services aren't going to be staffed up and funded properly to be able to handle it any other way. So follow the money. Other than that, I have no opinion.
That's all, huh, Chief?
I totally agree with the chief on the qualified immunity too. I think, and Kanisha and I were talking before we started today, sometimes it's a bit of a knee-jerk reaction and it sounds good, but in this area, I think it's one of those realms where we need to take a breath, and that, as we mentioned, the balloon cycles back and forth a little bit, but we need to take the time to get it right in this area as well. And you know what, I think policing is a noble profession. But once again, if we use that term profession, we have to hire professionals. We have to make training, and Chief Ramsey talked earlier about education. We have to continue to educate officers through their entire career. We have to adapt and evolve, whether it's dealing with crisis intervention teams and dealing with mental health consumers, or what other scenarios that officers are forced to deal with as we grow in our careers. But it has to be a profession where we continue to grow as officers. And when we talk about holding people accountable too, the one side I don't want to miss is the health and wellness of officers too. As the boss, as Chief Ramsey knows, officers see a lot of trauma. They're exposed to a lot of trauma in their careers. And we have to look at early warning interventions as well. Officers have extremely high rates of divorce, alcoholism, depression, PTSD that's being looked at more with increasing suicide rates. You know, we've got to make sure we're taking care of our folks too, and making sure we're getting them, you know, off the streets. If your wife's divorcing you, she's having an affair with somebody else, your dog pooped on the carpet, you've just had a really bad day, you know, you can't take off that suit and walk into your patrol car and think those things have just disappeared. We've got to, you know, make sure that officers have a mechanism to deal with any mental health situations, and that their other officers have a mechanism to report those scenarios if they see somebody struggling out there too, and make sure we're taking care of our people as well. So, you know, I'd ask Chief Ramsey this, you know, in all your careers of police, as your many years of policing, and I used to say, well, Chief Ramsey is the father of American policing. Now I'll say grandfather, but you know what, Chief, I'm sure you would do it all again, even in today's environment.
Oh yeah.
Profession. And you know what, police are going to evolve to do better. Body worn cameras, technology, we're going to do better, and it's still a great job. And you know what, it's a blessing. You're paid to help people. It might be that one time in their life where they're having that moment of distress, but we actually get paid to help people. I can't think of anything better.
I agree with you, Pat. I really do. I mean, I personally love it. I accidentally became a police officer, but I was just blind luck. But it's something that I was just destined to do. And even though I've been retired 4 years, I'm still involved. I mean, it's my life. It's what I do. So yeah, I do it all over again in a heartbeat.
You know, and I never was able to carry a gun. I did carry a badge. It made the commissioner nervous to think that I might carry a gun because, you know, I'm pretty serious at times. But you know, what surprised I think a lot of people, because everybody thinks of police as monolithic. They stick together, they got each other's back no matter what, and all that. But if you go and do a poll or survey of most police departments, they're going to tell you they feel like they don't have a voice. They're going to tell you that they don't feel that they're listened to. They're going to tell you that they think that the systems are not fair. Only the certain groups, SWAT and, you know, these specialized teams, homicide, they get all these perks. They're going to tell you that the system is not fair. Within the police department. And so, you know, Quincy, you asked the question about, you know, accountability and how do we make this balanced? You know, there was a term, it's not used so much anymore, but certainly when we were talking about police reform again in 2015, was procedural justice and legitimacy. And we've got to be able to have procedural justice and legitimacy in the community, but you've got to have that in the police department. I mean, it's chaos and anarchy when the rules are not clear, when you don't know if what you do is going to cause this action, unless it's your buddy that you went to the academy with, or it's the guy, you know, that slept with your wife, and, you know, is he going to have a problem with you, you know, and not be fair? And, you know, this sounds kind of like high school, but sometimes it's just that. And so those rules have to be fair. They have to be clear for the police officers as well. And then just on the qualified immunity real quick, because I think everybody else has touched on the main issues. Qualified immunity and the reasonableness in the mens rea, those are two sacred cows. And what you'll see is the police unions and most likely Republican legislators fight tooth and nail on those two things. And as Chief Ramsey said, it's a complicated issue. I think qualified immunity is going to be really, really difficult. But there may be a decent conversation to be had about the reasonableness standard. And because you have all of these situations where you have people saying, well, how could they do that? And how could they shoot that person? And all those sorts of things. And we're talking about a national standard on use of force. I think the reasonableness standard can be very subjective sometimes. And so I think that there is space for a robust conversation on what is reasonable, you know, when you're dealing with the public, particularly when you're talking about taking their freedom or their life.
Absolutely. I have to say this has been a powerful conversation where we've gotten some amazing, we couldn't have had a better group of panelists. I just want to thank you all very, very much. We've been able to touch on a lot of issues, and please believe I had 20 more questions. I think this is a conversation that could go on for days and days, you know, without giving a break, but we are coming up on time. So one of the things in our series that we've tried to do is to make sure that we leave our participants with some way that they can be impactful. So for my final question, and really quickly, if you could just tell us, you know, we're in the midst of this push for federal legislation and all, but everything happens on the local level. So what can individuals and executives and companies do to influence policing in their communities?
Real
Stay
quick.
involved.
Oh, sorry.
Involved.
Yes, I agree with the chief. Stay involved. But one of the things that I realized, we added external affairs to my title in Baltimore, because a lot of times communities, but also business and corporations don't know how to get involved with police departments. So the two things I would say is find out how you can help them pay for that technology that they need to hold folks accountable, and then also help and influence those legislatures. And then number three is police officers, just like teachers, go in their pockets all the time to pay for book bags, to pay for food, for pay for things that they see that constituents need on the streets. Help them start a fund so that, you know, if they want to buy a kid some ice cream, if they want to buy a book bag, if they want to do something to help in their communities, that they're not having to go in their own pocket, but rather they're using money from the corporate world to be able to do that and repair those relationships.
And I would say, and I heard Chief Ramsey lead with this too, just get involved. You know, I was very fortunate after leaving the Marshal Service to jump to the DC Police Foundation, which was started by Chief Ramsey and former Mayor Williams back in 2007. And really the majority of the work we do is building police community relations, especially with youth and especially minority youth. And our biggest goal is to keep young people out of the criminal justice system. So, you know, whether you're supporting community youth programs, police athletic leagues, there's so many ways to get involved. And as you know, Quincy, we're not successful unless we have the respect and trust of the communities we serve. That goes back to the foundations of police work. And sadly, you know, these recent incidents they've set us back decades. So we need to, you know, take that punch in the gut, keep moving forward every single day, every interaction. And I'm going to steal one from Chief Ramsey here, who used to say, you know, that hundreds of thousands of planes in the world take off and land safely every day, but you'll only hear about the plane crash. There's so many great interactions happening between police officers and their communities, and there's so much potential to build upon that respect and trust. There's a lot of work to be done, but there's a lot of ways to support those interactions and support especially community foundations, police foundations, and the people doing that great work in the community as well.
Chief, we'll give you the final word.
Well, again, thank you so much. This has been a fast hour. So, you know, hopefully we can do it again at some point in time. But these are very important topics. But for all the people watching this, don't give up on policing, because policing will not give up on you. We need to all work together to make our neighborhoods safe and to get the kind of service that you all deserve. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Chief. And once again, I just want to thank you all. This has been an amazing panel. Like I said, I don't think we could have assembled a better group of folks to have this conversation and really talk substantively about these issues, and appreciate the takeaways that you all gave us. You know, as a show of our gratitude for your involvement in helping us put this together, we will be making a contribution to a charity of your choice. And, you know, we just are really appreciative that you could help make our Dialogue for Change series a good one and an impactful one. You know, like I said, we've come to the end, but this is a series, and we want to invite you to join us for our next panel discussion to explore what racism looks like today. Please look to follow-up emails from Invariant for more details about the speaker series and for additional anti-racism resources. You can find us on Twitter, at Invariant, and on LinkedIn. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm glad that you all got to participate in this great conversation.